The desert wind carried no comfort, only the stench of blood and the rasp of a dying man's breath. For Doris Mayfield, a woman living on the bitter edge of civilization finding him was a death sentence. He was Apache, the silent enemy her town prayed to be rid of. His skin was fever hot, his body a canvas of wounds that spoke of a savage fight. But it was his eyes that held her captive, a silent storm of pride and pain. She dragged him into the cool darkness of her cabin, a secret that would surely hang her. What she didn't know was that this single act of mercy had sealed her fate far more than any noose. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Arizona territory, beating down on the cracked earth and sucking the life from everything that grew. For Doris Mayfield, it was just another day of coaxing survival from the dust. Her small homestead, a good 2-hour ride from the nearest town of Serenity's Reach, was more of a fortress against loneliness than a home. It was her late husband, Thomas, who had believed in this land, who had seen a future in its unforgiving beauty. All Doris saw now were his ghosts and the endless, shimmering heat. She was checking the perimeter of her small goat pen, her rifle resting in the crook of her arm, when she saw the buzzards. They circled low and lazy, a dark omen against the stark blue sky. A sick feeling coiled in her stomach. Buzzards meant death, and out here death was a neighbor you never wanted to visit. Curiosity, a dangerous trait in these parts, warred with her instinct for self-preservation. She cinched the brim of her hat, checked the load in her Winchester, and walked toward the gathering birds. He was lying in the shadow of a rock outcropping almost invisible against the red dirt and scrub. An Apache. The immediate cold dread that washed over her was a learned response drilled into every settler by tales of raids and bloodshed. His buckskin leggings were torn and soaked in dried blood, and a nasty gash ran from his temple down his cheek, matted with dirt and black flies. Another deeper wound in his side looked angry and infected the source of the metallic coppery smell that the wind carried. Her first thought was to back away slowly to pretend she'd seen nothing. He was likely dead, and if he wasn't, he was dangerous. Sheriff Jedediah Stone's words echoed in her mind from her last trip to town for supplies. "Any sign of hostiles you fire first, Mrs. Mayfield. Don't you hesitate. There's no room for sentiment in this land." But as she took a half step back, his eyelids fluttered. The movement was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He was alive. Doris froze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw the lean, powerful build of him, the sharp line of his jaw, the fall of his long black hair against the dust. He was young, perhaps her own age, late 20s at most. This wasn't the boogeyman from the campfire stories. This was a dying man. Thomas had been a doctor back east before the dream of the West had claimed him. He had taught her things: how to set a bone, how to stitch a wound, how to identify herbs for fever and pain. "The most important thing, Doris," he'd said, his voice gentle, "is to see the patient, not the ailment. See the person." Looking at the Apache, she saw a person drowning in his own blood. Cursing her own foolishness, she knelt beside him. His breathing was shallow, a dry, rasping sound. His skin was scorching to the touch. She knew if she left him, the sun and the buzzards would finish the job within the hour. If she helped him, she was inviting a world of trouble. Silas Blackwood, a rancher whose land bordered the northern edge of hers, and who refused to take her polite rejections of his advances, would use any excuse to make her life difficult. Finding an Apache on her land, he'd have a posse here before sunset, and they wouldn't be asking questions. Yet she couldn't leave him. The part of her that Thomas had nurtured, the part that still believed in compassion over fear, wouldn't allow it. It was a reckless, dangerous decision, and she made it in a heartbeat. Getting him back to the cabin was a brutal ordeal. He was unconscious, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She was strong, her body hardened by years of frontier life, but it took every ounce of her strength to haul him onto her spare horse, a sturdy mare named Patience. He slumped forward, his head resting against the horse's neck. With every step, Patience took a low groan escaped his lips, and Doris flinched her eyes, scanning the horizon for any sign of riders. Inside the cool, dim interior of her cabin, the world outside fell away. There was only the task at hand. She slid him off the horse and onto the cot Thomas had built, the one she usually kept piled with blankets. The scent of him, blood, sweat, and the earthy smell of the desert filled the small space. She worked with a desperate focus, her hands moving with a memory of their own. She stripped away the tattered buckskins, her movements clinical, trying not to notice the intricate beadwork or the powerful muscles that lay beneath. The wounds were worse than she'd thought. The gash on his side was deep, festering with sand, and God knew what else. She boiled water, her hands shaking slightly, as she laid out her precious medical supplies. Thomas's surgical needles, carbolic acid, and clean linen torn from her own petticoats. Cleaning the wounds was an intimate, gruesome task. He remained unconscious, though he occasionally cried out a raw sound of pure agony that twisted her insides. She disinfected, stitched the jagged flesh of his side with clumsy but firm hands, and packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey from her garden. As she worked, she saw the details. A tattoo of a hawk in flight on his shoulder, a long faded scar that ran the length of his left forearm. The calluses on his hands spoke of a life spent holding a bow, a lance, a knife. These were not the hands of a monster, but of a man who fought to survive just as she did. When she was finally done, she slumped into a chair, her body aching with exhaustion. The stranger lay still on the cot, his breathing a little easier. The fever still raged, but he was clean and bandaged. She had done all she could. She watched him as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. He was a secret she now had to keep, a life she had tied to her own. He was the enemy, the other a man whose people and her people were locked in a bitter struggle for this very land. But in the quiet of her cabin, he was just a man, vulnerable and broken. She had nursed a silent Apache stranger, and in doing so had invited the wild, unpredictable heart of the West right across her threshold. The silence in the cabin was heavy laden with the unspoken question of what she would do when he woke up. Days bled into one another, each marked by the rising and setting of the brutal sun and the state of the man on the cot. Doris fell into a new clandestine rhythm. Her chores were done with a hurried, watchful eye, her rifle never far from her hand. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant cry of a hawk sent a jolt of fear through her. She was living on a knife's edge, and the man in her cabin was the blade. He remained silent. For the first 2 days he drifted in and out of a fevered delirium, murmuring words in a language that was to her like the whisper of the wind through the canyons, unintelligible, but full of a raw, guttural power. She kept him hydrated with sips of water and willow bark tea to fight the fever. She changed his dressings, cleaning the wounds with a grim determination. The gash on his side began to close, the angry red softening to a healing pink. He was strong. His body was fighting to live. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. She came in from the goat pen to find him awake, his eyes open and clear. They were dark, intense eyes, and they followed her every move. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer the empty silence of unconsciousness, but a thick, charged silence, full of questions he wouldn't or couldn't ask. "You're awake," she said, her voice sounding loud and foreign in the quiet. She set a bowl of thin broth on the small table beside the cot. "You should eat." He didn't respond. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. His pride was a palpable thing in the small room, a wall he had erected around himself. He was a warrior, accustomed to strength and independence, and now he was weak, reliant on the mercy of a white woman, an enemy. She left the broth and retreated to the other side of the cabin, busying herself with mending a shirt, giving him the illusion of privacy. She didn't see him eat, but when she glanced over later, the bowl was empty. This became their routine. She would cook for him broth, then stew, then small pieces of bread, and leave it by the cot. She would speak to him in quiet, simple sentences, telling him about her day, about the stubbornness of her goat Martha, or the way the light hit the mesas in the morning. She didn't know if he understood her words, but she spoke them anyway, mostly to fill the crushing silence. "The wound on your side is healing well," she told him one afternoon as she prepared a fresh dressing. "You were lucky. Another inch to the left." She trailed off, not wanting to think about it. He allowed her to tend to him without protest, but his body would tense at her touch. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes. She saw not aggression, but a deep, ingrained vigilance. He was a man constantly on guard, even in his weakened state. One evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent desert tempests that seemed to spring from nowhere. Thunder cracked like a whip, and rain lashed against the cabin. Doris had always hated the storms. They made her feel small and vulnerable. As lightning illuminated the room in a stark, blue-white flash, she saw him jolt on the cot, his hand instinctively going to his wounded side. In that unguarded moment, she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt. Without thinking, she moved to the fireplace and added another log, coaxing the flames to a brighter, more comforting roar. "It's just a storm," she said softly. "It'll pass." He watched her, and for the first time, she thought she saw something other than suspicion in his gaze. It was a sliver of understanding, a shared recognition of the power of the elements. In that moment, they were not Apache and settler, but two people taking shelter from the same storm. Slowly, he began to regain his strength. He started to sit up on his own, his movements stiff and painful. One morning she came inside to find him standing leaning heavily against the wall, his jaw set in determination. Her heart leapt into her throat. "You should be resting." She chided, her tone sharper than she intended. He turned his dark eyes on her, and for the first time he communicated with more than just silence. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The message was clear. "I will not be an invalid." From then on, he pushed himself. He would stand for a little longer each day, then take a few faltering steps. He never spoke, but a new language formed between them, one of gestures and shared glances. When he needed water, he would look toward the bucket. When he was in pain, a subtle tightness would appear around his mouth. She learned to interpret these signs, and he in turn seemed to learn the rhythms of her life. He watched her knead bread, his eyes following the movement of her hands. He watched her clean her rifle, his gaze sharp and knowledgeable. The danger of his presence was a constant weight. Twice she had to make the ride into Serenity's reach for supplies. The trips were agonizing. She felt as if the word Apache were branded on her forehead. Silas Blackwood was there both times, his presence as oppressive as the midday sun. Doris, he'd said the last time, cornering her outside the general store, his bulk blocking her path. You're looking peaky. Life's too hard out there for a woman alone. His eyes, small and greedy, roamed over her. You know my offer still stands. A woman needs a man's protection. I'm managing just fine, Mr. Blackwood, she'd said, her voice cold and even. Are you? He'd smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. Been keeping to yourself more than usual. Folks are starting to talk. Wondering what you're hiding out there on that dusty patch of nothing. Her blood ran cold. She forced a dismissive laugh. The only thing I'm hiding from is unsolicited advice, Silas. Now if you'll excuse me. She pushed past him, her heart hammering. The ride home was filled with paranoia. Every rock formation seemed to hold a spy. Did he know? Had he seen something? The thought was terrifying. Back in the relative safety of her cabin, she found the stranger sitting at her small table holding one of Thomas's old books. He wasn't reading it. He was just looking at the letters. His brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes immediately registered the fear on her face. He rose slowly to his feet, a question in his stance. She shook her head, trying to reassure him and herself. It's nothing, she lied. Just a pig of a man in town. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she had the unnerving feeling that he could see right through her lie. He knew she was afraid, and he knew that her fear was connected to him. The silent patient was no longer just a patient. He was a presence, a partner in her secret, and the bond between them, forged in silence and shared danger, was growing stronger with every passing day. And with that strength came a new, more complicated kind of fear. What would happen when the silence was finally broken? The uneasy peace within the cabin walls grew more fragile with each passing day. The man she still had no name for him was healing with a speed that astonished her. The wounds were now puckered scars, and he moved with a restored, fluid grace. He had taken to carving using a small knife she'd hesitantly given him to shape pieces of scrap wood. He carved with intense focus, his hands deft and sure. He carved a hawk, its wings spread in flight, a perfect miniature replica of the tattoo on his shoulder. He left it on the table for her, a silent offering. A thank you. Doris found herself watching him more and more. She watched the play of muscles in his back as he stretched the way his long fingers handled the carving knife, the intensity in his eyes when he stared out the window toward the distant mountains, his homeland. A strange, unwelcome warmth would curl in her stomach. It was a dangerous feeling, a betrayal of Thomas, of her people of common sense. She was a lonely widow, and he was a handsome, mysterious man. She chided herself for the weakness pushing the feeling down into the dark corners of her heart, where she kept her grief and fear. The world outside the cabin, however, refused to remain at bay. Silas Blackwood was becoming a persistent threat. One afternoon, while she was tending her garden, he rode up unannounced, his horse trampling a row of her young corn. "Mayfield," he boomed, not bothering to dismount. "Sheriff's forming a territorial patrol. We're sweeping the area for any Apache stragglers from that raid over at the Johnson Ranch last month. Figured I'd let you know we'll be crossing your land tomorrow." Doris's heart seized. She forced herself to remain calm, leaning on her hoe. "That's good of you to tell me, Silas. I haven't seen anything unusual." His eyes narrowed, scanning her property with a predatory gaze. "Funny thing. Found some tracks a few days back, not far from your creek. Looked like a man on foot heading this way. A man wearing moccasins." She felt the blood drain from her face but kept her voice steady. "The wind plays tricks with the sand, Silas. I'm sure it was nothing." "Maybe," he said, his gaze lingering on her cabin. "Or maybe you've had a visitor. You remember what happened to the Millers down south? Took in a wounded Paiute boy. His whole war party showed up a week later. Wasn't pretty." He didn't need to elaborate. The story was a cautionary tale told to every new settler. "I can take care of myself," she said, her grip tightening on the hoe handle. "I'm sure you think you can," he sneered. "We'll be by tomorrow, around noon. Be a good neighbor and have a cool drink of water waiting for us." He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving her standing in a cloud of dust and dread. Tomorrow. Noon. She ran back to the cabin, her mind racing. The stranger was on his feet the moment she burst through the door, his hand reaching for the carving knife on the table. He saw the panic in her eyes. "They're coming!" She gasped, the words tumbling out. "A patrol. They'll be here tomorrow." He stood perfectly still, processing her words. She saw his gaze dart around the small cabin, at the cot he'd slept on, at the bowl he'd eaten from, at the wood shavings on the floor. He was a ghost here, but a ghost who had left traces. For the first time, she saw him truly worried, not for himself, but for her. He looked at her, then walked to the door and peered out. His eyes scanning the landscape that he knew as well as she did, but in a completely different way. He saw escape routes where she saw only rock and scrub. That night, neither of them slept. The silence was back, but it was a different kind of silence now, not of mystery, but of shared imminent danger. He sat by the window, a sentinel in the darkness, while she paced the floor. She had to get him out. But where? He was still not at full strength, and the open desert was a death sentence for a man alone and on foot. As dawn approached, he turned from the window. He walked over to her, his movements deliberate. He gently took her arm, stilling her frantic pacing. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching her face. Then he raised his other hand and pointed to the high mountains far to the east, the Dragoon Mountains, the heart of Apache territory. His home. The message was clear. "I have to go." She nodded, her throat tight. "When?" He held up one finger. "Tonight." The plan was desperate. He would leave under the cover of darkness. She would pack him what little food and water she could spare. It wasn't enough. She knew it, and she could see in his eyes that he knew it too. It was a gamble against impossible odds. Unbeknownst to them, they were being watched. Not by Silas Blackwood, but by two pairs of eyes hidden in a rocky crevice half a mile away. They were Taza and Geronimo, warriors from his band. They had been tracking their leader since the ambush that had left him for dead. It had been Nakai, a rival warrior hungry for power who had betrayed him, leading him into a trap set by gold prospectors. Taza Kael's younger brother had been the one to find the trail leading away from the ambush site. Not the trail of a dying man crawling away, but the tracks of two horses, one carrying a heavy burden. They had followed the tracks here to the white woman's cabin. For weeks they had watched. They had seen her find him. They had seen her drag him to safety. They had seen her nurse him, tend to his wounds, and feed him. They watched with a mixture of suspicion and awe. Their laws were clear. Any interaction with the white eyes was fraught with danger and betrayal. Yet this woman had shown their chief mercy. They had reported back to their council of elders. The wise man, Chochize, listened intently. The prophecy of the stargazer woman, a vision from generations past, was spoken of in hushed tones. It told of a time when their people would be on the brink of destruction, and a leader would rise who would be saved by a woman from the enemy's world, a woman with a spirit as strong as the mountain stone, and a heart as compassionate as the spring rain. This woman would be a sign, a bridge to a new way of survival. Chochise and the elders had seen the signs. Kael was their chosen leader, a man of vision and strength. This woman, Doris, had risked everything for him. The warriors were not just watching, they were judging. They were testing her spirit from afar. They saw her defiance against the brutish rancher Silas Blackwood. They saw the kindness with which she treated her animals. They saw the quiet strength in her solitude. They had chosen her. The prophecy must be fulfilled. Doris Mayfield was to be Kael's mate. It was not a matter of romance, but of destiny. It was the only path they saw for the survival of their people, a joining of two worlds, however violent and unwelcome. And now, watching the cabin, Taza saw the rancher's visit and the panic that followed. He saw the lamplight burn through the night. He knew the white eyes were coming. It was time for the warriors to act. Their plan was not just to save Kael, but to claim the woman the spirits had chosen for him. The whispers of prophecy were about to become a storm of action, and Doris's small cabin was directly in its path. The day of the patrol dawned heavy and suffocating. A knot of dread sat so tightly in Doris's stomach that she couldn't touch the breakfast she'd prepared. She and the stranger moved about the cabin with a tense, unspoken understanding. They erased his presence. The cot was folded and stored. The wood carvings were hidden. The floor was swept clean of any stray wood shavings. The cabin once again looked like the home of a solitary widow. He stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon, watching for the dust cloud that would signal the patrol's approach. He was dressed in a spare set of Thomas's old clothes, a simple cotton shirt and denim trousers. The fit was awkward on his lean frame, but it was better than the telltale buckskin. He looked less like an Apache warrior and more like a poor farmhand, though nothing could disguise the fierce pride in his posture or the intensity in his eyes. Doris packed a small satchel for him, a canteen of water, a block of dried beef, and a handful of hard-tack biscuits. It felt so pitifully inadequate for the journey he faced. As she worked, her handles trembled. "It's not much," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's all I have." He turned from the window and looked at the meager supplies. He then looked at her, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second. He reached out and gently touched the back of her hand, where it rested on the satchel. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a shock wave through her. It was the first time he had initiated any physical contact that wasn't born of necessity. It was a gesture of gratitude, of connection. A shout from outside shattered the moment. "Hello, the cabin, Mrs. Mayfield." It was Silas Blackwood's voice. They were early. Panic flared in Doris's eyes. There was no time for him to escape. The cabin had only one door and one small window at the back of the root cellar. He was trapped. The stranger reacted instantly. He grabbed the satchel, his eyes darting around the room. He pointed to the trap door that led to the small root cellar. It was a dark, cramped hole in the floor, smelling of earth and potatoes. Not a hiding place for a man, but the only option they had. "In there." Doris breathed, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Be silent, no matter what you hear." He gave her a single sharp nod, his eyes locking with hers for a brief, intense moment. Then he lifted the heavy wooden door and disappeared into the darkness below, pulling the door shut just as the heavy thud of boots hit the porch. Doris smoothed her apron, took a deep, shuddering breath, and opened the door. Silas Blackwood stood there, a cruel smirk on his face. Behind him were Sheriff Jedediah Stone and two other grim-faced men from town, all armed with rifles. "Afternoon, Doris," Silas said, his eyes sweeping past her to scan the inside of the cabin. "Told you we'd be by. Just checking on our neighbors, making sure everything is secure." "Sheriff," Doris said, nodding curtly to the older man and ignoring Silas. "Everything is fine here." Sheriff Stone, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with weariness, tipped his hat. "Just a precaution, ma'am. Mind if we take a look around? We're tracking a wounded hostile." The words hit her like a physical blow, but she kept her face a mask of neutrality. "A wounded one? I haven't seen anyone." "That's what you said last week," Silas interjected, pushing his way inside. The other men followed their boots loud on the wooden floor. Her cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt small and violated. They moved around the room, peering into corners, their suspicion a foul odor in the air. "Smells different in here than usual," one of the men commented, sniffing the air. "Like herbs or something." "I make poultices for my goats," Doris said smoothly, her mind racing. "One of them cut its leg on the wire." Silas walked through the small space, his eyes missing nothing. He ran a hand over the table, paused by the fireplace. His gaze fell upon the trapdoor to the cellar. He stopped his boots directly over the spot where the stranger was hiding. Doris's blood turned to ice. "What's down there?" Silas asked, nudging the door with his toe. "My root cellar," Doris said, her voice tight. "Potatoes, preserves, the things a woman alone needs to survive the winter." "Handy," Silas mused, a predatory gleam in his eye. He bent down and gripped the iron ring on the door. "Let's have a look. A cellar is a fine place to hide a man." "There is nothing down there," Doris said, stepping forward. "Just my winter stores." "Then you won't mind if we check," Silas said, yanking the door open. A wave of cool, earthy air washed into the room. Doris held her breath, bracing for the inevitable shout of discovery, the explosion of violence. She stared into the dark opening, her body rigid with terror. The cellar was empty. She blinked, confused. It was impossible. She had seen him go down there. The space was tiny, with nowhere to hide. Silas and the sheriff peered into the gloom, their faces illuminated by the light from the cabin. "See?" Doris said, her voice shaking with a relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. "Potatoes, and my canned peaches from last fall." Silas grunted, clearly disappointed. He let the door slam shut. "Still say something ain't right here." Sheriff Stone seemed satisfied. "All right, Silas, that's enough. We've troubled the lady long enough. Sorry to bother you, Mrs. Mayfield." He tipped his hat again and herded his men toward the door. Silas gave Doris one last, lingering, suspicious glare before following them out. She watched from the doorway as they mounted their horses and rode away their dust trail, a testament to her narrow escape. She leaned against the doorframe, weak with relief, her body trembling. How? How had he vanished from a sealed cellar? A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around. The stranger was standing by the fireplace. He hadn't been in the cellar at all. Her mind reeled, trying to understand. The back window in the cellar was tiny barred and led to a 3-foot drop into a rock-hard patch of earth. There was no way he could have slipped out that way without making a sound. He watched her, seeing the confusion and shock on her face. He took a step closer. The cabin was silent, the air thick with the aftermath of fear. And then he broke the silence that had defined their time together. They are gone. The voice was low and raspy from disuse, but clear and resonant. The English was perfect accented, but fluent. Doris stared at him speechless. All this time, all her one-sided conversations, all her assumptions that he was a savage who couldn't understand her. He had understood everything. You can speak English." She stammered the words, feeling foolish as she said them. "I can," he confirmed. He gestured toward the cellar door. "When you told me to hide, I knew they would look there first. The oldest trick. I climbed into the chimney flue." She looked at the fireplace. The flue was narrow, coated in soot. It was an impossible hiding place, a feat of agility and strength that defied belief. He had wedged himself into the darkness above the hearth while she stood guard at the door. The first twist, the first layer of the mystery of this man, had been peeled away. He was not just a silent, wounded warrior. He was intelligent, cunning, and had been playing a role, biding his time. "Why?" she asked, the question encompassing everything. "Why didn't you speak?" He looked at her, and the wall of pride and suspicion in his eyes finally began to crumble, replaced by a weary gravity. "In my world," he said slowly, his voice gaining strength, "silence is a shield. It allows you to listen, to see who a person truly is. I saw you, Doris Mayfield. I saw your heart." He took another step closer, his presence filling the room. "My name is not stranger. It is Kael." The name hung in the air between them. Kael. He had a name. He had a voice. The man she had saved was gone, replaced by someone far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The secret in her cabin was no longer a silent one, and the revelation felt less like a relief and more like the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying story. The revelation of Kael's name and voice changed everything. The cabin, once a space of quiet care and unspoken assumptions, now crackled with a new volatile energy. The questions Doris had held back for weeks came pouring out. Kael in turn began to share pieces of his story, his words painting a picture of a world she had only known through the distorted lens of fear and prejudice. He told her he was the son of a chief destined to lead. He spoke of Nakai, a warrior consumed by jealousy and ambition, who saw Kael's desire for peace and diplomacy as weakness. It was Nakai who had orchestrated the ambush, using a skirmish with prospectors as a cover to eliminate his rival. Kael had been left for dead, betrayed by his own kind. He hadn't spoken at first, because he didn't know if Doris was another trap, another enemy. "You showed me mercy when your people would have shown me a rope," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "Trust is a rare stone in a barren land, Doris. You gave it freely. I had to be sure." This newfound intimacy was as dangerous as Silas Blackwood's threats. They were no longer just nurse and patient. They were two people from warring worlds, bound by a secret that could destroy them both. The small kindnesses sharing a meal, the warmth of the fire, were now layered with a deeper, more personal meaning. Doris found herself drawn to his quiet strength, his sharp intellect, and the profound sadness that seemed to live behind his eyes. But their fragile peace was destined to be short-lived. Silas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. Humiliated by his fruitless search and fueled by a venomous cocktail of jealousy and suspicion, he became obsessed. He was convinced Doris was hiding something, and he used his influence in Serenity's reach to poison the well of public opinion against her. He started with whispers in the saloon. "That widow Mayfield. She's too friendly with the silence of the desert. It ain't natural for a woman to be so alone." The whispers grew into accusations. "I tell you she's a sympathizer, an Indian lover." The tracks I saw led right to her door. Fear is a contagion, and in a town like Serenity's Reach, built on a foundation of anxiety, it spread like wildfire. The memory of the Johnson raid was still fresh. People who had once tipped their hats to Doris now averted their gazes. The storekeeper, who had always saved her favorite bolt of calico, was suddenly sold out. She was an outcast, branded by Silas's malicious gossip. Sheriff Jedediah Stone, a man who preferred peace to conflict, found himself caught in the middle. He was pressured by Silas and the growing mob mentality of the townsfolk. "I have no proof, Silas," he argued, his weary voice strained. "Proof?" Silas spat his voice, booming in the dusty street. "The proof is in her arrogance. The proof is in the tracks I saw. Are you going to wait until we're all murdered in our beds? We need to ride out there and get the truth out of her one way or another." The breaking point came a week after the failed patrol. A young boy chasing a runaway dog claimed to have seen a figure in the window of Doris's cabin. A man with long, dark hair. It was all the proof Silas needed. He bypassed the sheriff's authority, rallying a dozen men with whiskey and fear. They were no longer a patrol. They were a posse. A lynch mob. Kyle saw them coming first. He was on the small ridge behind the cabin, testing his strength, when he saw the cloud of dust in the distance. It was too large for a single rider. He sprinted back to the cabin, his movements swift and sure. "They're coming," he said, bursting through the door. There was no panic in his voice, only a cold, hard readiness. "At least 10 riders." Doris's blood ran cold. This was it. The moment she had dreaded since the day she'd found him. She ran to the window and saw the dust cloud, now resolving into the dark shapes of horses and men. "There's no time," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to run." "And leave you to face them." Kael's jaw was set like granite. "They are not coming to talk, Doris. They are coming to kill." He looked around the cabin, his warrior instincts taking over. "This place can be defended." The idea was insane. 2 people against a dozen armed men. But looking at the grim determination on his face, she felt a surge of defiance replace her fear. This was her home. She had fought the land, the loneliness, the grief. She would not let Silas Blackwood and his pack of bullies take it from her. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady now. "Bar the door. Block the window," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority she had never heard before. "How much ammunition do you have?" "Enough," she said, pulling Thomas's old rifle from its pegs and her own Winchester. She also had a pistol, a gift from her late husband. For a while, at least. They worked in a flurry of desperate activity. They dragged the heavy oak table to barricade the door. The single window was shuttered and barred from the inside. The cabin was plunged into a dim, tense twilight, pierced only by thin slivers of afternoon sun through the cracks. The posse arrived with a thunder of hooves and a chorus of angry shouts. "Doris Mayfield!" Silas's voice roared from outside. "We know you've got him in there. Send out the Apache devil, and we'll spare you." Doris peered through a small crack in the shutter. The men had surrounded the cabin, their rifles held ready. Their faces were a mixture of fear, hatred, and whiskey-fueled bravado. "Go to hell, Silas," she shouted back, her voice surprising her with its strength. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door, just inches from her face. The siege had begun. Inside, the world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. Kyle moved with a calm, deadly grace. He took the pistol, checking its load. He handed her the Winchester. "Stay away from the door and the window," he said, his voice low. "Shoot only when you have a clear target. Aim for their shoulders or legs. We don't need to kill them, just drive them back." His tactical mind was clear. He wasn't a savage, bent on slaughter. He was a leader, trying to survive, trying to protect her. Another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls. Wood splintered. A bullet punched through the wall and shattered a clay pot on the mantelpiece. Doris flinched, but held her position. "They're trying to draw our fire," Kyle said, his eyes scanning the perimeter through a tiny knothole, "to see where we are positioned." The afternoon wore on a terrifying exchange of punctuated gunfire and tense silence. One of the posse members grew bold and tried to rush the door with a heavy log. Kyle fired the pistol. A cry of pain from outside told them he had hit his mark. The assault on the door ceased. They were trapped low on ammunition and hopelessly outnumbered. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows, desperation began to creep in. Silas grew more enraged with every passing minute of defiance. "They're bringing something," Kyle said, his voice grim. "I can smell it. Kerosene." Doris's heart stopped. They were going to burn her out. "They mean to burn us alive," she whispered in horror. Kyle looked at her, his face illuminated by the dying light. There was no fear in his eyes, only a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "You should not have to die for my life, Doris." "I made my choice the day I brought you here," she said, reloading the Winchester with her last few cartridges. "I won't let them win." Outside, Silas's voice rose in a triumphant, drunken roar. "Last chance, witch! Come out or burn!" They could hear the sloshing of the liquid as it was splashed against the dry wooden walls of the cabin. The acrid smell of kerosene filled the air. In the suffocating darkness, Doris and Kyle stood back to back, weapons raised, ready to face the inevitable fire and the final desperate firefight for their lives. The siege of Serenity was about to reach its fiery, deadly climax. The siege reached its terrifying climax as dusk settled. From outside, Silas Blackwood's voice, thick with hate, boomed, "Last chance, witch, come out or burn!" The acrid smell of kerosene suddenly saturated the air, seeping through the walls. A moment later, a torch arced through the twilight, landing on the roof with a devastating whoosh. Flames erupted, devouring the dry timber of Doris's home. The crackle of the fire was a sound of absolute finality. Panic coiled in her gut, hot and suffocating. "They mean to burn us alive," she whispered in horror. "They think we are trapped," Kyle said, his voice a low, urgent command. He pulled her away from the advancing smoke and heat toward the rear of the cabin. "They will get careless. We make our own door." He slammed his shoulder against the log wall beside the stone fireplace. Once, twice. On the third try, aided by Doris, 2 weathered logs splintered and gave way, creating a jagged opening to the cool night air. Smoke and embers billowed around them. "Now!" Kyle yelled. He pushed through the gap and pulled her after him into the smoky twilight. The entire front of her cabin was a roaring inferno. Her life, her sanctuary, was being consumed by the senseless hatred of one man. And that man saw them. "There!" Silas roared, breaking away from the cheering mob. He raised his rifle as they scrambled for the cover of the rocks behind the cabin. "They're getting away." A shot splintered the rock by Doris's head. Kyle shielded her with his body, and they were pinned down, the rest of the posse now turning their attention toward them. There was nowhere left to run. This was the end. But as Silas took aim for the killing shot, a new sound tore through the night, a high, chilling war cry that echoed from the surrounding hills. It was answered by another, and then another. Like ghosts emerging from the darkness, a dozen Apache warriors on horseback descended upon the posse. The attack was a whirlwind of disciplined fury, turning the gleeful mob into a terrified scramble. Leading the charge was a warrior who moved with a singular purpose, his eyes locked on Kael. Silas, stunned by the sudden turn of events, let out a final yell of rage, swinging his rifle back toward Doris. An arrow sprouted from his chest before he could fire. He crumpled to the ground, his dead eyes reflecting the flames he had set. The battle was over in moments. The lead warrior leaped from his horse, his face a mixture of relief and fierce pride. "My brother," he said in the Apache tongue, clasping Kael's arm. "We have found you." "Taza." Kael breathed, his voice thick with emotion. Taza's gaze then fell upon Doris. He looked from her to the burning cabin, and his expression was not one of gratitude, but of cold, unnerving assessment. The other warriors formed a silent circle around them, their rescue feeling less like a liberation and more like an acquisition. "The council has spoken, brother," Taza said, switching to a clear, precise English that was clearly meant for Doris. His words were heavy absolute. "The spirits led us to you. They showed us the woman who saved you, the one foretold in the prophecy of the Stargazer woman." Doris stared confused. Prophecy? Taza ignored her, his eyes fixed on Kael. "The elders have confirmed it. Her courage in the face of the enemy, her mercy toward you, it was the sign. She is the one who will be the bridge for our people." He finally turned his intense, unyielding gaze to Doris. "Our warriors watched you. We tested your spirit. It was not your choice to save our chief," Taza declared, his voice flat and final. "It was your destiny, and it is your destiny to be with him. The warriors have chosen you as his mate." The fire behind her crackled, a funeral pyre for her old life. The circle of warriors was a silent, unyielding wall, but Doris's spirit refused to be cornered. Taza's words, "His warriors have chosen you for him," were not a sentence of destiny, but a declaration of war on her will. A cold fury, sharp and clean, cut through her grief. She turned her blazing eyes from Taza to Kael. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice dangerously low. "Was I just a test, a prize to be claimed? I knew of the prophecy." Kael admitted, his voice heavy. "But not that they had chosen you." "It does not matter." Taza interjected, his hand on his knife. "It is our way." "Your way," Doris shot back, stepping forward. "You speak of my courage, but deny me a choice. You're no better than the men who just tried to burn me alive." A murmur rippled through the warriors. Taza stiffened with insult, but Kael moved between them, placing a firm hand on his brother's chest. "Enough!" he commanded, his voice ringing with the authority of a chief. "She is right." He turned to Doris, his tormented gaze meeting hers. "My people are desperate, Doris. They cling to this prophecy as a drowning man clings to driftwood. They saw strength in you that they believe can save us." He looked at the smoldering ruin of her home, then back at her. "But a bridge cannot be built from only one side. It cannot be forced." Kael's eyes locked onto hers, shutting out his brother, the warriors, and the world. In them, she saw not a chief weighing the needs of his tribe, but the man she had nursed back from the brink of death. "What grew in that cabin was real," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "It had nothing to do with destiny. It had to do with you and me." He took a deep breath and raised his voice for all to hear, making his stand. The spirits may have guided my warriors to her, but they will not make her a prisoner. The choice belongs to her." He extended his hand, the gesture a stark and powerful challenge to the ancient tradition surrounding them. "I offer you a life with me in my world," he said, his voice clear and strong. "It will be hard. You will be a stranger, but you will be my partner, not my captive. You will be free." He paused, the next words costing him dearly. "Or my warriors will see you safely to a new town far from here to start again. I will honor your decision, whatever it may be." The choice hung in the smoky air. Her past lay in ashes behind her, a world that had ultimately tried to destroy her. Ahead was an unknown, perilous future, but one that held a man of honor who was willing to defy his people for her. She looked at his outstretched hand, then into his unwavering eyes. The path was uncertain, but for the first time it was entirely her own to walk. Slowly, Doris placed her hand in his. "My home is gone," she said, her voice steady and sure. "My past is ashes. I will help you build your bridge, Kael, but I will walk across it as your equal." A profound relief washed over Kael's face as his fingers closed around hers. He turned to his people, his grip on her hand unshakable. "We will build our future not on the laws of the past," he declared, "but on the foundation of courage and choice." As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, Doris stood with Kael, her back to the ruins and her face toward the horizon. She was not a prize of prophecy, but a woman who had stared into the fire and chosen not just to survive, but to build anew. Doris and Kael's story is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a testament to the idea that our choices, not our circumstances, define us. It's a story about courage, the bravery to show compassion in a world consumed by hatred, and the strength to forge a new path when the old one turns to ash. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound connections are found across the deepest divides, and that true strength lies not in forcing destiny, but in having the courage to choose it. If their journey from a silent cabin to the dawn of a new future touched your heart, please honor their story by hitting that like button. Share this tale with others who love epic dramas of the heart and the untamed frontier. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring the legends and struggles of the past to life. Your support is the campfire that keeps these tales burning bright. Thank you for listening.